YouTube universe. Welcome back to Reading for Sunday on our Thursday in the third week of Lent. I'm super glad you joined us again, and we've got a really interesting passage to dive into today. We haven't looked at the gospel reading yet this week, and the gospel reading is from John chapter 2. So, if you have Bibles, go ahead and open to John chapter 2. John chapter 2, go ahead and pull that out, and we'll take a look at it. I've got my appropriately titled notepad, and I've got the gospel. All right, so John chapter 2, we pick up in this piece after then he went down to Capernaum. The story that comes right before this is this fascinating story with Mary and Jesus at the wedding. And Mary tells his disciples, whatever he tells you to do. And that's to me, that's a really important story, but it's not the story we have for this week. The one we have for this week is a really interesting story also. And this is a story where Jesus, at the time of the Passover, goes into the temple and clears out all of those folks who were, it says, we're trading animals, we're selling animals for sacrifices and all of this kind of stuff. It says he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So Jesus' act here, not act, but action, what Jesus is actually doing is casting out the marketplace, right? That this marketplace had set up as a way for people to buy animals that they needed for sacrifices, for their religious practices, and so he casts them out. There's a ton of different things we can do with this passage, and I'm not sure which ones are right and which ones are wrong necessarily. One thing you see when people read this passage is they'll say something like, when Jesus casts out the money changers and the folks leading these marketplaces in the temple, what he's really doing is casting out religion, right? That what he's saying is all of these symbols and all of these practices of your religion that have gotten in the way of relationship with me are problematic, and he casts them all out. You can find guys who make that argument. I'm fairly sure that's a little bit overblown. There's some element of that for sure going on here, probably, but to make that the whole case doesn't make sense. You can also say that what Jesus is really mad about is some sort of unfair market practices, right? And then this can become a passage that you use to argue against sort of some things we do in capitalism and some of the ways certain markets work in different places, and that what he's really doing is he's just evening the playing field, that he's leveling it out so they can kind of restart. It sort of doesn't read that way all the way either, though, right? You have these things about zeal for your house and this sort of thing. You also have people that will hear this passage as a prophetic, dramatic action, right? So that he's doing something as a prophet that's going to fall on the lines of like Jeremiah running naked through the streets and Hosea marrying a prostitute and those kinds of things, right? That his actions, what he's actually doing is demonstrating in his actions some sort of prophetic call against the people. This one actually makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that's for sure what he's doing, but it doesn't resolve the question of what that action's about necessarily. So we're left with this weird conversation that Jesus is going to have about the temple, right? The people say, well, give us a sign that you're actually the Messiah, right? Give us a sign that you're actually going to do the things that we want you to do. Give us a sign that you're really the person that God sent. And Jesus says, if you tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it again in 3 days. Knowing the end of the story, our brain should be going crazy with these connections, right? That the temple is also this place beyond just a place that's been practicing these unfair market practices. It's also a place that is this religious spot, right? And it's something that the prophets have railed against over and over and over again. And this 3 days thing, this sounds so much like cross and resurrection to us that it's going to be hard not to hear that, right? And in fact, I think we're probably meant to hear it. That's why Jesus uses that language. So, what do we do with this whole thing? Well, one of the pieces we do with it is I think we want to pay attention to this language of signs. We talk about I talk about signs a lot because I think it's something that we misunderstand. And John uses signs everywhere else where anybody else uses miracles. John's going to talk about signs, and signs are a short prophecy, a short immediate prophecy that gives you confidence in the longer term prophecy. Right? A short immediate prophecy that gives you confidence and tests the veracity of the longer term prophecy. We can get in that at a future point, but that's essentially what a sign is. So John is going to say all of the things Jesus does that everybody else calls miracles, that John calls signs, those signs all point to something, right? They're not just miracles. They're not just standalone supernatural events, but they're signs that point to the reality of who Jesus is. Now, he's not going to talk about that in this passage, but it's going to come up again in the Gospel of John, right? So the signs, so John is saying Jesus does these practices, these miracles, or whatever we would normally call them, but he's going to call them a sign. He does these signs because they're short-term prophecies that show us the long-term reality of who Jesus is, that Jesus actually is the Messiah, or in John's language, Jesus is the Logos who created the whole world and comes back to rescue his people.